Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Elizabeth Wakefield, Associate Painting Conservator in the Conservation and Science Department here at the museum. One of my responsibilities is evaluating the condition of paintings that our curators are considering for acquisition. I had the pleasure of working closely with Jacquelyn on this particular acquisition, from the initial examination when the painting was on view at TEFAF in Maastricht in March 2024, to a more thorough assessment once it arrived at the Art Institute of Chicago later that year. It is my privilege to welcome you as we learn about this exciting new addition to our collection, Frans Francken II's Flemish masterpiece, Esther before Ahasuerus. Today's presenter will contextualize this painting within its historical moment, highlight its innovative iconography, and investigate the figure of Esther as a model of female fortitude. As we begin, may I remind you to please silence your mobile devices. It is now my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Dr. Jacquelyn N. Coutré. As the Eleanor Wood Prince Curator in Painting and Sculpture of Europe at the Art Institute of Chicago, Jacquelyn has overseen the reinstallation of the 17th century Dutch and Flemish galleries, acquired paintings by Edward Collier and Maria van Oosterwijk, and curated the exhibition Van Gogh and the Avant-Garde, the Modern Landscape. She specializes in early modern Northern European art with an emphasis on Rembrandt's circle, artistic competition and exchange, and collecting histories. Now please join me in welcoming Jacquelyn to the stage.
Hello, everyone. I would like to reiterate my respect and deep regard for Elizabeth, who actually saw the painting before I did at the Fine Art fair in Maastricht, and she was essentially live tweeting me her thoughts on its condition. So truly, without her, the painting would not have come into our collection. So thank you, Elizabeth. Signed and dated 1622, this radiant scene of Queen Esther before her husband, the Persian king Ahasuerus, depicts one of the greatest acts of heroism in the Hebrew Bible. And it also is executed by one of the most prolific painters in Antwerp in the 17th century. It was rediscovered in 2006, and it illuminates the fine, colorful, multi-figure compositions that the artist, Frans Francken II, is most well known for. And it also depicts a strong female protagonist, which I in particular am very excited about. I believe it was mentioned in the program description that it has been almost 15 years since we acquired a painting from Flanders in the 17th century. And I hope to celebrate this painting today by explaining why this was the painting for us, why we at the museum say it is an Art Institute painting, and also highlight really what it does to contribute and expand the narratives that we can tell in our galleries. We acquired it last year, late 2025, through the generosity of an anonymous donor. So I would like to extend my thanks to that donor. It is essentially the story of Esther, coming from the book of Esther. She is situated at the center of the painting, metaphorically, literally, and she kneels before her husband, the Persian king Ahasuerus. And before we get into too much of the narrative, I want to just call attention to the very creative and intentional, I would argue, ways in which Francken creates a sense of intimacy between these two figures, even though there are more than 20 represented in the painting. They are husband and wife. He is elevated on his throne. He is engaged in a moment of, shall we say, royal kingship, and she is kneeling before him. And yet Francken still creates a moment of locked gaze, and the two figures are leaning towards each other. In fact, Ahasuerus literally is leaning forward off of his throne, extending his scepter to Esther, and she is extending her hand forward in his direction. So this gaze, I think, is very fundamental to the power of this painting. But of course, there's a lot more going on. Esther is, in fact, the second wife of Ahasuerus. His first wife was banished for disobedience, and I call your attention to that. That will, I think, echo in the telling of the story that we see here. But she was selected for her beauty. And so I call attention here to her exquisite clothing, which Francken has rendered with some incredible detail. The floral pattern on her silk dress, parts of it even scratched in with what we call the butt end of the paintbrush, the non-brush end. He has taken incredible pains to outline her earrings, her fine jewelry, her diaphanous veil. But all is not right in this scene. Esther is, in fact, on a mission. She is on a mission to request an audience with her husband, which is exactly what we see happening here. Why is she requesting audience? Well, it turns out that the man standing next to her husband, Haman, is his vizier, one of his high-ranking officials. And out of sheer spite, he has issued a decree to slaughter all of the Jews in the Persian Empire. And this is a moment that stems from the fact that Mordecai, Esther's cousin and guardian, who is seen at the far right, has offended Haman. He refused to bow to him not once, but twice. And so Haman has issued a decree under the king's name that the Jews be slaughtered. However, there is a complicating factor here in that Esther herself is Jewish, and her husband does not know this. Further complicating, or heightening, shall we say, the tension of this scene is that by coming to her husband, requesting audience with the king without permission could result in death. So in seeking to protect her community, Esther is risking her own life by going before her husband. That is the scene that we see represented here. But of course, there is much more of the narrative that unfolds. And to share that in a matter of 20 seconds, I will summarize and say that, as you can read in this painting, her husband responds favorably to her request. They meet over the course of 2 dinners in which she reveals her own Jewish background and also reveals Haman's conspiracy. Ahasuerus does not respond favorably. I'm delighted to know that. And in fact, he issues a decree demanding Haman's execution. He appoints Mordecai in his place, and that is what we see in the background. Mordecai is wearing Haman's clothing and riding his horse. And he issues a decree which, in fact, allows the Jews to fight against the Persians who have been ordered to slaughter them. Unfortunately, he can't rescind Haman's decree, but he can authorize the Jewish population to fight for their lives. And in fight they do. Thousands are murdered, but it is very important to know that none of the Jews take spoils. So this is very much an act of self-defense. They are not trying to profit from this situation. And as many of you may know, we are on the eve. Monday evening is the celebration of Purim. And it is, in fact, the holiday of Purim that Mordecai institutes to celebrate this grand moment of the salvation of the Jewish people. It derives from the Hebrew term pur, meaning lot, because Haman had cast lots to determine the date upon which the slaughter would take place. And Purim is celebrated by Jewish communities throughout the world through the reading of the book of Esther, oftentimes on a scroll such as this with beautiful illustrations, through the celebration of a festive meal, the sharing of gifts among friends and family, and the giving of donations to the poor. And for many people, it is often a time for a costume party. And in fact, this completely aligns with the biblical tale. After all, there is a lot of masking happening. Esther does not reveal her Jewish origin to her husband. She does not reveal her plan to intervene in Haman's conspiracy until the appropriate time. And after all, Mordecai ends up wearing the clothing destined for Haman. So really, you will see at a Purim party some of the main protagonists, Esther and Haman on either side here, but also you can see characters not related to the story, for example, icons like Madonna and the late Queen Elizabeth. So this perilous moment is the one that is depicted in our painting, and as many art historians have noticed, Francken draws upon a very strong visual tradition, specifically in the print realm, from the 16th century. For example, Ahasuerus is cloaked in ermine. He is seated on a throne, sometimes on a dais, and he is accompanied by various courtiers in his retinue. It is in particular, the print of Jorg Pence on the right that Francken seems to be paying attention to, because in this scene, Esther reaches out to touch the scepter of her husband. And it is with that scepter that he grants mercy. This is the visual indication of him granting her audience. But it really must have been the print by Philips Halle after Martin van Heemskerk that Francken was looking at. You can see that he really adopts the sumptuous atmosphere with the Persian carpet covering the dais, the very lavish clothing with multiple gold chains, and even the presence of the court canine. And of course, Halle also has a very large retinue there, comparable to, as I said, the more than 20 figures that appear in Francken's painting. Now, I have to brag here for a moment that our painting featured recently in an exhibition at the Jewish Museum titled The Book of Esther in the Time of Rembrandt, the Age of Rembrandt, excuse me, where it really was a standout artwork. And in fact, in that exhibition, it was surrounded by prints by Halle after Heemskerk. So that was very nice, I thought, juxtaposition. It was also surrounded by other objects that are used during the Purim holiday, various silver objects, this taza, the Purim plate, for example. And while many of these objects related to the holiday depict this scene of Esther before Ahasuerus, it is a good reminder also that domestic objects were adorned with this scene as well. After all, Esther was held up as a symbol of feminine virtue in the 17th century. And so she adorned objects for the home, pillowcases, reliefs carved onto cupboards. What else? Of course, book covers, etc. So she is very much a woman of the household, and this exhibition demonstrated quite powerfully, I thought, all of the ways in which this specific scene would have existed in the world of the 17th century viewer. And in particular, in the home, one can think about Esther and Ahasuerus symbolizing strength, peacemaking, and a meaningful marital bond. Francken himself made a specialization of this particular narrative. We believe, according to the paintings that survive today, that he executed at least 9 interpretations of the Feast of Esther, which occurs after our narrative episode, and at least 3 versions of Esther kneeling before Ahasuerus. So it's interesting to think about this one 17th century Antwerp painter really digging deep into this narrative and exploring all of the dramatic potential that he could. But of course, he was not the only painter who reveled in this story. Rembrandt, a painting in Ottawa, has often been considered to depict Esther, the moment that she is at her toilet after 3 days of praying and fasting to prepare herself to seek audience with her husband. And of course, it offers, in Rembrandt's hands, a wonderful opportunity for that dramatic chiaroscuro and the shimmering, resplendent clothing for which he is so known. The Flemish painter Hendrik van Steenwyck opted for another moment, a moment under the cloak of night when Esther meets with her cousin Mordecai to discuss their plan. And even Southern European painters reveled in this scene. For example, Artemisia Gentileschi, who painted some of the most compelling scenes with strong female protagonists, adopted this for a painting that is now in the Metropolitan Museum. Her rendition seems to be based on an apocryphal, shall we say, addition to the story, a moment in which Esther goes before Ahasuerus, and he is so shocked by her impudence that he grows angry, and she, out of fear, faints. Images of strong women have long had appeal, not only today, but even dating to the Renaissance. And the story of Esther very much corresponds to images that fit into a visual and literary phenomenon known as the Weibermacht, or the power of women theme, that was very popular in Germany, Flanders, and the northern Netherlands. And I show you two scenes here, one of Solomon praying to idols before his wives and concubines, the story being there that his pluralistically leaning, shall we say, wives and concubines urged him to pray to multiple gods, to idols, so leading him off the proper religious path. On the right, we have a very playful scene of Phyllis riding Aristotle. Aristotle being, of course, the great philosopher. He warned his pupil, Alexander, to stay away from that Phyllis. She's no good. And whether it was actually Alexander or his father who was potentially seduced by Phyllis, unfortunately, Aristotle fell privy to her wiles as well. And she took example of this and decided that she would ride him like a horse, which he succumbed to. And of course, Alexander learned of it and lost a bit of respect for his instructor. So this theme of the Weibermacht, the power of women, is very much about upending gender roles in the early modern era. And sometimes it is it has an emphasis on women really using their sexual wiles to get one over on men, but sometimes it really is an issue of bravery and saving a larger community. And currently right now we have in our galleries two paintings that I would say fit into this category, one of which is Northern European, that of Judith by Jan Sanders van Hemesen. Judith has many parallels to Esther, in fact. Also a Jewish heroine who dresses in her finest clothing, sneaks into the tent of the Assyrian general Holofernes with a pretext of seducing him before he goes and attacks her own city of Bethulia. But between her beauty and maybe a bit of alcohol, she manages to render him unconscious, at which point she uses a sword to chop off his head. And I particularly love this painting by Hemesen because you see where his head is located. There is no love lost between Judith and Holofernes. Among our Southern European paintings, we have a truly gorgeous painting of Salome with the head of John the Baptist by Guido Reni. Salome requested the head of John the Baptist on a plate after she did a seductive dance for her stepfather. And in response, in gratitude for this dance, he asked her for one wish that he could grant. And at the behest of her mother, whose integrity was insulted by John the Baptist for having married the brother of her dead husband, she asked for the head of John the Baptist on a plate. So she managed to silence that critical tongue through her feminine powers. What I love about this particular scene of Esther kneeling before Ahasuerus is that it really emphasizes her agency. She has taken it upon herself, after consulting with her cousin, to risk her life and ask this grand request of her husband. And I think Francken intentionally wanted to emphasize her agency. For example, in the background, we have a statue of the combined Greek god Hermathena, who is known for its cunning, and a parrot, which was recognized in the 17th century for its eloquence, for the way it can imitate the human voice. And of course, it is through her words that Esther convinces her husband to intervene in this terrible situation. Could I have the next slide advanced, please? Perfect, thank you. And I would like to thank Elizabeth for her beautiful ex-radiograph of the painting. We know, in fact, that this niche with the statue and the parrot were later additions by the artist himself, but that he had originally conceived of the curtain next to it, extending much further over. You can see the folds of the curtain here over where the current niche is. So in fact, Francken decided that he wanted to emphasize the acumen and cunning of Esther. And I would argue he also does this through two animals inserted into the lower right-hand corner, a couple of monkeys. The one monkey, I think, is trying to bait the other, lure him into a trap to bring him out from his hiding spot, just as Esther does towards Haman. I find it very amusing that Francken used two monkeys, for just at this time, in the 1620s, he begins to develop a new genre of painting known as a singerie, in which monkeys satirically sit in the place of humans, playing board games, drinking excessively, etc. So I think Francken is making a self-referential moment here within his own painting. I must confess that not only is the front of the painting absolutely gorgeous, but so is the back. It is uncradled, which means that there is no lattice work applied to the back to help stabilize the wooden panel. But this means that we can see every bit of the wood grain. We can observe any interventions that have taken place on the back of the painting over the course of its 400 years. And what is really a delight for Elizabeth and me and those of us who like these dorky things is that there is this stamp here, which I understand is probably hard to read, but I wanted to give you a moment to look at it. If you turn it right side up, it is, in fact, the brand of the city of Antwerp. And so we have two hands here raised above a very abstract castle. And so this would have been burned into the back of the panel before the painting was executed on it to ensure the quality of this panel, that it was not overly dry, that it was not infested by insects or anything else that would compromise the painting once it was applied. Interestingly, there is also an upside-down A here, and we know that the panel assessor who used the brand of the city of Antwerp combined with the A, although we don't know his name. We do know that he was a panel assessor around 1621-22, which is exactly when this painting was executed, 1622. It's always a relief when these things line up on front and back. Antwerp in the 17th century was devoutly Catholic. In 1585, the city had fallen again to the Spanish after a, shall we say, 25-year revolt. And so it was one of the bastions of Catholicism. And the cathedral today still remains dedicated to the Virgin Mary. And for those of you who know the city well, you may be familiar with the 150 or so small statues of the Virgin and Child that adorn various corners or exteriors of buildings. They're part, shall we say, protector, part artistic intervention, but they really reinforce and would have in the 17th century the Catholic pride that suffused the city. And so in Antwerp and in Catholic lands, Esther would have been seen as a typological predecessor for the Virgin Mary. After all, the Esther intercedes on behalf of the Jewish population before her husband, just as the Virgin Mary intercedes on behalf of humankind before God. And in fact, Peter Paul Rubens, the great painter par excellence in Antwerp, painted two panels of both Esther on the left and the Virgin on the right for the Jesuit church that was being built and decorated in the early 1620s in Antwerp. So this is a nice reinforcement of that connection between these two great female heroines. And it is, in fact, around Rubens that our Flemish 17th century collection is organized. And so Francken really provides a fascinating antipode to the great Peter Paul Rubens. Rubens, who went to Italy in 1600, spent 8 years there drinking in all of the achievements of Raphael and Michelangelo, comes back to work in a variety of media, and executing grand heroic figures on a large scale. Francken trained with his father. He's in fact part of a dynasty of about 4 generations of painters in Antwerp. Never leaves the country, we think. In 1605, he joins the guild in Antwerp and spends his entire career there, likely overseeing a large workshop with his brothers, perhaps a pupil or two, and creating a very large output. So with the addition of this new painting by Franz Francken, we can really expand the ways in which we talk about painting practice and the dynamism of the scene of painters in Antwerp in the 17th century. We can also expand the number of paintings that we have showing large women. And I would argue in this day, more than ever, we can really focus on moral fortitude in the face of injustice across historical areas. Thank you. For those of you who have questions, we have a few minutes for those. For those of you who are dying to go see the painting in gallery, it is located in Gallery 208 in the Allerton building.
We have time for a few questions.
It is oil on wooden panel, yes.
And in terms of conservation, is that better or worse?
It's different. Is that fair to say, Elizabeth? If you go upstairs and see the painting, because it is uncradled, the board has warped slightly. You'll notice an actual curve if you lean to the side and look at it, but that is completely natural because wood is organic and it does shift and warp over time based on humidity and weather conditions, atmospheric conditions. So it is in incredible shape, but in order to protect it for future generations, we do have it behind glass.
We have one over here.
You mentioned that the painting was rediscovered fairly recently. What's the sort of history of ownership and location?
We know for certain that the painting was in a British collection, that of a barrister in 1831. It was sold through Christie's at that time. And it went into a collection, we believe in Belgium, in fact. But then its location is unknown to us until it reappeared on the market in 2006. And then it was bought by a Belgian collector again. It was in a Belgian collection. It was purchased by a dealer who sold it to a private collector, who in turn placed it with a dealer, and now it has come to us. So a very long life it has had.
We have one up here.
I'm wondering about the frame. That looks like a big, strong frame there. Is that 300 years old too? Is that put on last week? Or?
It was put on a year or two ago, perhaps even 10, to emulate a 17th century frame. The profile very much is in keeping with ebonized frames that adorned paintings both in the northern and southern Netherlands during that time. And I think it works quite well. It's relatively rare to have a 17th century frame on a 17th century painting because people chop down frames like nobody's business over the course of the last 400 years.
Thank you,
Great. Well,
Jacquelyn.
Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you upstairs.